Good afternoon. I'm Brian Ross, and this is a special report from the headquarters of the Law and Crime Network in New York. A day of painful memories today for the country. 17 years ago today, the United States was attacked by al-Qaeda terrorists who hijacked 4 airplanes and flew them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon outside Washington, D.C. At memorial services today in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, the almost 3,000 people who were killed that day were remembered. With the remembrances also come still unanswered questions, questions that grew out of that horrible day, questions we will pose in our special report this afternoon. Are we safer? What about the first responders and others who are the new victims? Why is there still no justice, no trial for the 5 men charged with being the masterminds of the attack? And what about the war in Afghanistan, launched as a response to the attacks, the longest war in American history, with no end in sight? We begin with Richard Clarke, the White House counterterrorism advisor on the day of the attack, whose warnings about the threat of al-Qaeda went unheeded by the administration of George W. Bush. Mr. Clarke, now a private security consultant, joins us from Washington. Let me begin by asking you about how you recall that day, Mr. Clarke, as you received reports from inside the White House about the attacks.
Brian, it became very clear to us very quickly that this was a terrorist attack, and there was only one group we thought likely to have done it. So we thought very early on it was an al-Qaeda attack, and we thought it would continue. I was in the White House with the Vice President and National Security Advisor. The President was in Florida. Vice President Cheney appointed me as the National Crisis Coordinator, and I called a meeting of all the cabinet members via our secure video network and began to coordinate a response. The first thing I wanted was for all of the aircraft that were aloft at the time, and there were over 2,000, to land immediately at the closest airport so that we could prevent further use of these aircraft to attack us. We did not know at the time how many aircraft had been taken by the attackers. We had reports of as many as 8 aircraft being unaccounted for. Initially, we began before the Pentagon was hit, and certainly before we knew about the fate of United 93 in Pennsylvania. We thought the White House was a target, so we evacuated it, except for our crisis team and the Vice President's team in the bunker. We thought the Capitol could be a target, so we landed a helicopter on the Capitol grounds and evacuated the Speaker of the House, who is third in line to become president if the President and Vice President died. There was a whole series of things we did instantly, closing borders, alerting military facilities and diplomatic facilities around the world, evacuating buildings, calling in emergency management units. The first few hours were essentially spent in a response mode, first responder mode, trying to deal with the immediate effect of the attack. Later in the day, we began preparing for President Bush. When he returned to the White House, we began preparing response options.
But at that point, you had no doubt it was al-Qaeda?
I had no doubt at all. We had been anticipating a major attack for a couple of months by al-Qaeda. We had intelligence that suggested they were planning something. CIA believed that attack would take place overseas. They suggested it would be in Saudi Arabia or the Persian Gulf, Arab Gulf area. I believed it was possible it would be in the U.S., but we didn't have any specific intelligence that would tell us precisely when, where, or how.
Mr. Clarke, you have been warning at the White House about just such an attack, but no one seemed to be listening. And later you went before Congress with your now famous admission of government failure. Here's what you said.
Hearings because of the opportunity they provide to the American people. to better understand why the tragedy of 9/11 happened and what we must do to prevent a reoccurrence. I also welcome the hearings because it is finally a forum where I can apologize to the loved ones of the victims of 9/11, to them who are here in the room, to those who are watching on television. Your government failed you. Those entrusted with protecting you failed you. And I failed you. We tried hard, but that doesn't matter because we failed. And for that failure, I would ask, once all the facts are out, for your understanding and for your forgiveness. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to take your questions.
That was an astounding moment. How about the moment today when you look at what's happening and when you visited the 9/11 memorial?
Well, the memorials in Shanksville, in Arlington, at the Pentagon, and especially the memorial in New York, are incredibly moving, incredibly well done memorials to the victims and to the first responders. I think we can be proud of those memorials as a country. But we are still at risk. And your question today, are we safer? The answer to that, I think, has to be yes. However, it's followed by the word but. Yes, we're safer, but Al-Qaeda still exists. A new terrorist group since 9/11, ISIS, which is probably even more powerful today than Al-Qaeda, still exists, despite the fact that we have lost over 5,000 additional U.S. personnel fighting these two terrorist groups since 9/11, despite the fact that we have spent over $1 trillion in two theaters of combat, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and additional hundreds of billions of dollars trying to shore up our defenses here at home through Homeland Defense programs. Could we still have a major attack here in the United States? It's much more difficult to do, and it would be very, very unlikely. But we cannot say it's impossible. We know, Brian, that they are trying still to create bombs that they could carry onto aircraft, bombs that would not be detected by our current detection technology. And so we could still have the possibility of a U.S. flag aircraft being blown up over an American city. That's remote, but it's not impossible.
So even with all of the security precautions taken by TSA and the cockpit doors on the aircraft and all this going on, you still think it's possible that could happen?
No, what happened on 9/11 could not happen. What the terrorist groups we know are trying to do is to design and build bombs that could get through TSA security. Bombs that would be made out of substances that would not show up on the magnetometers, would not show up when baggage is screened, and could be signaled to go off when an aircraft is over an American city. You remember the infamous so-called underwear bomber,
right,
who tried to blow up an aircraft over Detroit. The guy who designed that bomb taught a lot of other people how to make bombs. And even though we think he has now been killed, there are lots of other people out there working for ISIS and Al-Qaeda who know how to make sophisticated bombs.
That man's name is Ibrahim al-Asiri, and there have been reports, not yet confirmed by the U.S. government, that he was killed in Yemen in a U.S. airstrike there. If those reports were true, wouldn't you consider that to be an important victory? Well,
they tried for years to get him. And certainly if they did get him, as they believe, as CIA now believes they did, if they killed him recently, that's a positive step. But the problem is that during the years they were trying to get him, he taught many other potential bomb makers what he knew about sophisticated designs for bombs. So we cannot say that that threat has been utterly removed. The problem is now there are other people out there, perhaps a dozen or more, and we don't know their names and we don't know their whereabouts.
Do you believe Al-Qaeda itself is still a threat, or are they a defunct organization?
Now, Al-Qaeda is still around. It's still present in Afghanistan. It's still present in Iraq. But more interestingly, Brian, it is now present in Africa, in countries in the sub-Saharan region, in places like Niger and Mali and other regions of the world, including the Levant and including areas in Libya. There are still Al-Qaeda cells, groups that say they're Al-Qaeda and are not ISIS, that say they're Al-Qaeda. We don't know for sure what command and control mechanisms exist among these groups, but we do know there are thousands of people around the Middle East and Africa who claim they are Al-Qaeda.
If you had your old job as the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the White House, what would you be advising President Trump that he should do now?
Well, I think the advice to President Trump that he has been getting from General Mattis and others is correct, and that is don't give up the fight. Don't pull out of Afghanistan. Don't pull out of Syria. I know it's very frustrating that we're still in Afghanistan 17 years after we went in October of 2001. But were we to pull out now, a group, the Taliban, would take over the country, a group that has ties to Al-Qaeda. And we could see once again Afghanistan become a sanctuary where terrorists from around the world could go and train in safety.
We talked before, after 9/11, about thinking outside the box, connecting the dots. What dots need to be connected now?
Well, I think we have to imagine that there will be new threats, new kinds of attacks. The dog that hasn't barked yet is a terrorist group using cyber war, cyber weapons to do destruction. We've seen power grids knocked out through cyber attacks in the Ukraine. We've seen companies destroyed, having all their computers wiped out in attacks. But we haven't seen that done yet by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They may not have the capability, but they have money. And it may be possible someday for them to hire independent hackers who will engage in cyber war against facilities in the United States. We've already seen attacks like the NotPetya virus take down hospitals in the United Kingdom and the United States. All the machinery in the hospitals ceases to work. All the records are wiped out. That sort of thing can happen. Earlier this year, the city of Atlanta had many of its systems fail, city government systems fail, because of a cyber attack. Again, not done by Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but you have to believe, Brian, that they're watching and that they'd like to be able to do that kind of attack.
Richard Clarke, thank you very much for your time on this special day. And by the way, you can listen to Dick's podcast, The Failed State or The Future State, on iTunes. When we return, questions about the first responders who've become a second set of victims of the attacks of 9/11.
Lorraine G. Bay. Todd M. Beamer.
We continue now with our special report. As the country and the world today remember the 9/11 attacks and the almost 3,000 people who were killed that day, there is growing concern about a second set of victims, those first responders and others in the area who were exposed to the toxic clouds of dust when the two towers of the World Trade Center collapsed. It has become an extremely emotional issue with an outpouring of concern. Joining us to talk about it and the legal implications is a lawyer who represents many of the victims, David Eisbrook of the law firm Eisbrook Marsh. Mr. Eisbrook, I should say, full disclosure, you are the father of one of our colleagues here at the Law&Crime Network, and welcome.
That would be true. Thank you very much, Brian. Please call me David.
Give me a sense of the scope of this issue and whether it is scientifically based.
Well, first of all, the Victims' Compensation Fund, which was created as a result of the Zadroga Act being signed into law by President Obama in 2011, created a fund where people, just not first responders, but individuals who lived, worked, or went to school below Canal Street during the 8 months following 9/11 are now able to receive compensation from a nearly $8 billion fund created by the government, which means, in broad respect, is that if you've been diagnosed with any cancer and you meet the presence requirement of being below Canal Street, any cancer, you receive compensation. You're entitled to receive compensation from the fund, also respiratory illnesses.
Any cancer or respiratory illness without proof necessarily that it's caused by the toxic dust.
Well, the proof element, Brian, is very interesting. The reason that the fund was created was to eliminate the proof aspect of a litigation. This is not a litigation. You're not suing an entity or the government or the city or a country to receive this compensation. This is a fund that was created specifically to compensate people if they meet the two-prong requirement. The two prongs being the illness, the disease, and the presence requirement of living, working, or going to school below Canal Street. So they're fairly liberal in their interpretation of being down there, but you do have to, and we do have to file proofs to substantiate and to prove that people were down there at the time.
And what sort of illnesses are you seeing as a result of this toxic dust?
There have been 10,000 cancers diagnosed since 9/11. There are a myriad of respiratory illnesses, a myriad of cancers that have been diagnosed. In the last year, from June 17 to June 18, there have been 8,400 people registered with the World Trade Center Health Organization, which is another prong of the process. People first have to register with the World Trade Center Health Organization program to become certified, and then they become eligible in the Victims' Compensation Fund. So to answer your question, a myriad of cancers, a myriad of respiratory illnesses.
We saw reports last week of a number of men diagnosed with breast cancer. Highly unusual.
Highly unusual, but I believe the report indicated there were 15 men diagnosed with breast cancer. There are people from all walks of life. There was another article recently about FBI agents. At the time, one FBI agent was killed during the 9/11 attack. Subsequently, I believe 15 FBI agents have been diagnosed with cancers or respiratory and have qualified for the fund.
Who's pushing back against this? Anybody?
Great question. The fund is presently due to expire in December 2020. President Obama in 2015 extended the fund through 2020. The monitoring aspect through the World Trade Center Health Program was extended to 2090, but you can only file a claim for compensation till December 2020. So to answer your question, who's pressing back against this? For the first 10 years when this act was trying to get passed, there was resistance because of the funding aspect. Some factions of the Republican Party then resisted the passage of the act. They were trying to position it as offsets against the Bush tax cuts at that time. They wanted the tax cuts extended. They were basically playing their political game. What happens now with the Trump tax cuts in 2020, where does the money come from? To date, approximately only half of the fund has been utilized. Half of the $8 billion has been paid out to approximately 20,000 claimants. So doing the math, the fund has only been in existence for roughly 7 years. They've gone through about half of the funds to date. If it extended another 7 years, then the question would be what happens after that. But first, you'd have to get Congress to extend the 2020 deadline, at least till a time period when all these funds are utilized.
So that's the issue now, whether there's a cutoff in 2020, and there's quite a campaign underway because of that. And comedian Jon Stewart has been helping to lead the campaign, and he recently appeared on the NBC Today program with 2 first responders to try to make sure that the first responders and others got their full legal rights. Here's what happened to that clip.
I've known Rich and John for many, many years. John through the Feel Good Foundation and Rich through the fire department. And these guys were instrumental in lobbying to get the Zadroga Act passed, which brought health care to the first responders and survivors and victims. And unfortunately, we just passed a horrible milestone, which is over 10,000 cancer cases, 9/11 related.
So it's been 19 years. Isn't that enough time to determine who does and doesn't have an issue because of the toxic dust?
Absolutely not. Dr. Crane, who is the medical director of the World Trade Center Health Program, recently was quoted, and accurately, that cancers that manifest because of toxic exposure sometimes will take decades to actually come to fruition, similar to asbestos claims with mesothelioma. These funds are being set up for individuals who worked around asbestos sites from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 20, 30, 40 years after the exposure. Similarly, in 9/11 claims, the same thing will happen. People will be diagnosed with cancers and respiratory illnesses 20, 30, 40 years. We're only 17 years out right now.
That far out?
Yeah, that far out.
And what kind of money would that require if you're going to give compensation to all those victims?
Well, if we just do the simple math of $8 billion being allocated, let's say for the first 10 to 12 to 15 years, there would have to be significant dollars allocated for the next 20 to 30 years.
And if the eligibility period is not extended past 2020, what happens to those people who then develop respiratory diseases or cancer?
Brian, great question, because right now the medical monitoring is extended till 2090, but the fund is only extended to 2020. What happens to those people? This fund was implemented and created for the specific purpose of eliminating litigation and lawsuits against the entities I mentioned before. This fund was created to eliminate the proving liability. This fund was created so people would receive compensation relatively easily. And might I mention also that the cancers do start at $250,000 plus economic losses. So if the fund was not there anymore and people were diagnosed and you almost have a quasi-proof that it's related to 9/11 toxins, then do these lawsuits start up again? We hope not. We hope the government, we hope Congress, we hope the president, either this president or the next president, will do the right thing and extend it. And this, most likely, in my opinion, will be a major issue during the upcoming campaigns.
And what have you heard from the Trump administration about this issue?
Well, he hasn't called me recently, and no surprise there. But it's interesting you asked that Mr. Trump, in my opinion, again, has stated he has tremendous vision. He's always stated that he saw people across the Hudson River in New Jersey applauding at the 9/11 attacks. That's his vision. I hope he has the same vision to look forward to compensate the people who were hurt and killed because of those attacks.
Has the White House taken a position on the extension?
Not that I've heard of.
You think they should?
Absolutely. And the time is now. You don't want to wait until 2020. You basically want to get the ball rolling. I would think after the midterm elections coming up, you have a new Congress coming in 2018, 2019. That'll give it, a year, year and a half. You need the foot soldiers running, before the 2020 elections.
David Eisbrook, thank you very much for being here today. Keep us posted on your work as the cases continue to.
Brian, thanks
when we
for having me.
return, what the men charged as the masterminds of the attacks. Why has there been no trial 17 years later? Justice denied.
A senator attacked a Supreme Court nominee and called him a racist for alleged comments after 9/11. Stop. Stop. Please, stop using the bones and ashes of our loved ones as props in your political theater. Their lives, sacrifices, and death are worth so much more. Let's not trivialize them or us. It hurts. To my mom and to all of you and your loved ones, never forget.
We continue with our special report from the Law and Crime Network. 9/11, painful memories, troubling questions. The 19 hijackers who carried out the attack were all killed. The al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, has been killed. But at the special prison at the Guantanamo base run by the U.S. in Cuba, 5 of the other alleged masterminds are still awaiting trial. Why has it taken that long for justice? Joining us now to answer that question is Eugene Fidel, one of the country's leading lawyers who practices and teaches military justice. He joins us from the Yale Law School, where he is the Florence Rogatz visiting lecturer. Mr. Fidel, thank you for being here. Why has it taken so long for that trial?
Well, there's a host of reasons. Brian, and they fall in a variety of boxes. One is that, for better or worse, the government decided not to use the federal district courts for the prosecution of these cases. The federal courts obviously are the jewel in the crown of our legal system, and they should have been used. Instead, the Bush administration decided to dust off a process that had last been used in the World War II era called military commissions. And that was a terrible miscue. It was unnecessary, and I think it was probably done for a sort of optical reasons to demonstrate.
And do you believe there can be justice for the families who are awaiting the outcome of this trial?
I don't see how that can happen. I mean, eventually it'll happen, but we've already experienced a delay that is wildly inordinate. I understand why it's happened, but the fact is that these cases have moved at a snail's pace, and the families have every right to be completely beside themselves with anger.
Do you think that's what the government wants, is a delay like this, a slow roll, so nobody has to ever answer?
No, I don't believe that's the case. But the government has been sort of chronically ineffective at bringing these cases to trial. What are some of the reasons? To the extent that they're capital cases, what the implication is that the defense lawyers obviously knock themselves out, as you would do in any capital case. The defense lawyers, by the way, are not to be faulted for that. That's their job. That's what the legal system expects. That's part of what the Constitution requires, effective assistance of counsel. But there are other reasons that have complicated matters. One is the extent to which there's a national security overlay. There's a lot of classified information, and the government has gone to great lengths to protect the classified information. Now, the fact is that doing that makes any legal proceeding tremendously cumbersome and time-consuming. And it also means that a lot of the important shots are being called by people who are out of the public eye. In other words, it's in important respects, I believe, not the judges in the military commissions that have been presiding over these trials. It's been people in the intelligence community that have held the whip hand. So that's a major problem. And then finally, if I can get a little philosophical, Brian,
Sure.
What we have here in having dusted off the military commission format for the litigation of these cases is a tiny jurisdiction. There's so few cases. It's not like the state or federal courts where you have thousands of precedents to deal with, and the territory has been charted intensively. Instead, you have basically a micro jurisdiction, a nano jurisdiction, with only a handful of cases, and everything has to be examined from scratch. And my own conviction, no pun intended, is that this system is simply too small to be viable. It's a handful of cases. The precedents simply aren't there in many, many instances. Nobody has any experience with it. Inevitably, there's been a sort of revolving door problem, both on the prosecution side and the defense side, and that's a serious problem. Finally, let me talk about judges for a second, if that's okay.
Sure.
The U.S. Supreme Court early on was persuaded to weigh in. It had to weigh in on a variety of fundamental issues. For example, does a federal court in the United States have authority to issue orders that run to Guantanamo Bay? If so, do non-resident aliens, people who are unlawful combatants, we've heard that phrase over the last, 17 years, do they have a right to invoke the process of the federal courts? If they do, just what are their rights? And there have been a host, and so the Supreme Court more or less resolved those, at least some of them. But after a certain point, the Supreme Court seems to have it had run out of ammunition.
Let me ask you this question, Gene.
It wound up delegating a lot of the authority to a court in Washington, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and then has refused since then to weigh in. And that, I think, is very unfortunate.
President Obama had promised to shut down Guantanamo, but never did. And this year, President Trump, in his State of the Union address, made it clear Guantanamo would not be shut down while he is in office. This is what he said.
I am asking Congress to ensure that in the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda, we continue to have all necessary power to detain terrorists wherever we chase them down, wherever we find them. And in many cases, for them, it will now be Guantanamo Bay.
Mr. Fidel, is that good public policy, you think?
It's terrible public policy. The story of Guantanamo and the military commissions is a story of failure of our legal system and of our political system. And the notion of keeping it for symbolic reasons, or worse yet, to send more people there, is completely preposterous, in my opinion. We have, for better or worse, we have a lot of prisons in the United States. We have probably too many people behind bars. That's a common view of scholars of the field. The idea of creating or perpetuating a sort of Robben Island or a Devil's Island in a foreign country is really very unsound. And I think, the next president, whoever that is, has got to take a fresh look at this and put out of mind the idea of persisting with Guantanamo, which, by the way, is costing the taxpayers a fortune. And in an era of austerity, we've got to be looking at every penny. And we're not talking about pennies here. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to keep this place going. You know, after World War II, the Allies in Berlin had Spandau Prison. You remember. And it came to a point where they were 4, 3, 2, finally just one person, war criminals, kept in Spandau because we couldn't reach agreement with the Soviet Union, in Berlin. Eventually, the last prisoner either died or was released, and Spandau was shut down. We don't need a Caribbean Spandau prison.
If these trials had been held in a federal court in New York or anywhere in the U.S., would they be over by now?
Yes, the trials would unquestionably have been over. And one of the reasons for that, Brian, is that federal district judges have life tenure. They are as independent as judges as the world has ever seen. They're used to ruling their courtroom with iron fists, sometimes with a glove on the iron fist, but they rule firmly. In sharp contrast, the military judges who have presided have had a sort of the time is not of the essence attitude. And they've struggled with things like efforts by the Defense Department to require them to stay at Guantanamo until the cases have been completed. When the Defense Department imposed that obligation, the judges basically did a mutiny, which I thought was preposterous. This system is a bad fit, and we should just bag it and get these cases into federal district court and stop this. It's entirely unfair to the victims. It's also unfair, by the way, to the accused, although the accused interests are in protracting things because they're capital defendants.
And finally, what message does it send that we have a Guantanamo to the rest of the world?
It's an awful message. But unfortunately, the current administration seems not to care what messages we are sending to people in other countries.
Gene Fidel, thank you very much for being here. When we return, another troubling question. The war in Afghanistan, launched in response to the 9/11 attacks, no end in sight, with a huge cost in lives and money.
Grieve not, nor speak of me with tears, but laugh and talk of me as if I were beside you, for I loved you so. 'Twas heaven here with you. Thank you.
And my grandfather, Ronald Carl Fazio Sr., you now have 4 grandchildren who never got the opportunity to meet you, but love you very much, and never go a day without thinking about you. We miss you, Grandpa.
The 9/11 attacks led to what is now America's longest war, as the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, which had served as a safe haven for the al-Qaeda terrorists who carried out the attacks. Since then, more than 2,400 U.S. service members have been killed there, as have tens of thousands of Afghan civilians. The total cost is approaching $900 billion for military operations and efforts at reconstruction. No one's been keeping a closer eye on all this, especially the reconstruction money, than John Sopko, who is the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. His hard-nosed look at what is happening there has not earned him many friends in Washington, as he laid out without any obligations at all his findings to Congress. Joining now is Mr. Sopko. John, you've told Congress you consider it a stalemate. Is it still a stalemate?
Unfortunately, I think it is. The only positive news is the possibility of reconciliation and peace, and we all hope for that, both the Americans and the Afghans. So that's a positive development, which we hope will proceed.
As you've looked at all the money being spent, how much has been wasted? How much has been thrown away?
You know, that's hard to determine. We were just recently asked by Congress to come up with a number, but rather than focus on that exact number, I think we should just realize it's been billions, and it was just too much. I mean, if you look at the counter-narcotics program, we spent over $6 billion on that, and the only thing we have to show for that is the fact that Afghanistan is now the largest producer of opium and heroin in the world. And so it was billions. It was just too much was wasted.
So despite the presence of the U.S. troops and all the money spent, this is now the largest producer of heroin in the world?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It has been for a while. And there's no end in sight. We don't even have a strategy to fight the narcotics. And we've warned our mission, and we've warned the Afghan government that without dealing with the narcotics problem, which is now over 30% of their GDP, gross domestic product, you're never going to win in Afghanistan. You're never going to have democracy. You're never going to be able to cut the economic ties between the Taliban and their narcotics trafficking and their support.
And when that's brought to the attention of U.S. generals and to the White House, what response?
Well, I must say the current administration did listen to us, and they announced a plan to actually go after the major traffickers and the major drug suppliers, and that was a good proposal. I mean, you know, ignore the farmers because they get pennies on the opium crop, but look at the big fish. The unfortunate thing is it was a bombing campaign, and they oversold it. The numbers that came back from the Pentagon was very suspicious. I mean, about how successful it was. I think you need to be honest with the American people and the Afghan people. This is going to take a while, and it's going to be a real slog.
Mr. Sopko, you have told Congress of a new set of issues that have classified many of your findings so they cannot be made public. This is what you told Congress late last year.
So I have a list of reports here that I think all of you have probably read, dealing with the Afghan Navy that didn't exist, dealing with the camouflage that didn't exist, and dealing with an airplane that cost nearly $500 million that couldn't fly. Using the new test, I would not be able to tell you in a public setting or the American people how their money is being spent. So this is a slippery slope, sir, that we are now on.
So, Mr. Sopko, how much don't we know because of that?
Well, we don't know a lot. And it's not that we need to know our tactics. We need to know who we're going to fight tomorrow or what's the status of an individual Afghan unit. We're talking about basic information that the American taxpayer and the American Congress should know about. And that's being classified. Now, the good news is that our military was trying to get it declassified. The bad news is that the Afghan government, so some nameless, faceless, corrupt, probably bureaucrat in some Afghan ministry, is determining what the American taxpayer should know. And that I am upset about. And I think the Congress should be upset about that, and you, the taxpayer, we, the taxpayers, should be upset about that, particularly on a day like today. We're commemorating 9/11. We should consider also the 2,400 Americans who died. The thing, Brian, is the Taliban knows what's going on. The Afghan people know what's going on. They know what roads they can't go down. They know what districts are controlled by the Taliban. The Afghan government knows. The U.S. military knows, we hope. The only people who don't know are the people who are paying for it, who are paying the money to train and pay for the salaries of the Afghan military, the Afghan police, etc. They don't know how their money's being spent. They don't know if they're getting the best bang for the buck. And that's what I find outrageous. It was Lincoln who said, give the American people the truth and we will be free. And I think that's a problem we have and we still confront in Afghanistan.
And to what extent is this driven by corruption of Afghan officials with Swiss bank accounts or accounts around the world?
Well, I don't know exactly what it is, but we do know that obviously there are a lot of ghost soldiers and ghost police. So I assume there's some ghosts that are the money's going to the pockets of some generals and some officials, and they may be behind this, or it just may be that they don't quite understand the importance of transparency. I mean, transparency is so important because that's what keeps us, our government, on its toes. And this overclassification is a problem. I'm hoping with a new national security advisor in Afghanistan, who used to be the ambassador here in the United States in Washington, D.C., and that maybe we'll be able to talk some sense to those officials and who are disagreeing actually with our U.S. military. Our U.S. military is saying declassify this stuff. But since the data is coming from the Afghans, they have no control over it.
And so this must be very frustrating for you, finally, just quickly here.
Well, it is frustrating, but I think, yeah, it is frustrating. I think it should be frustrating to every taxpayer. I mean, we're paying for the war. We want to know what are we getting for the dollar. We're paying for reconstruction. The other thing is, how can we alert Congress to problems if the information is classified?
Mr. Sopko, thank you very much. Please keep us posted as you continue your efforts and be safe on your next trip to Afghanistan. The pain of what happened that day 17 years ago is still very fresh for so many as the U.S. continues to feel the aftershocks.